right. Hello again. This is Philip Steiger at thebest3d.com, and in this tutorial, I want to explore taking you to the moon, or rather, bringing the moon back down to Earth. What I'm talking about, of course, is pictures of the moon at various stages. This one here, about the half moon. I just took a few more pictures this morning. Let's see what they look like. A bit closer to the new moon, and just wanted to discuss how to work with that, if we can find it. I'm using Earphone View here to do a quick sample. Let me do this. Let me go and grab this one, actually, perhaps a little bit more. We want to have enough margin around it. Something like that, and cut this out, or Control X to cut it. And then I'm going to go into Howler and work this up into a brush image that we can then use to stamp it in different places. And we want to be aware of just a few things as we do so. So first thing we'll do is we'll Control V to paste it in as a new image, replacing the existing image. And so here we go. Let's go store this image, store this one. And so what we need to do is turn the TV off first of all. And all right, so this may not be the crispest or the very best, but it'll do okay for later compositing into another scene. All right, I mean the moon will eventually be much smaller, perhaps in the background of a big scene. So what we need to identify is, well, what part is the moon and what part is not. The thing is, if we use just the color to determine that, for instance, if we use the selection by color, select by color key, we get a good idea here by selecting the dark blue, a little bit of tolerance, not too much, but you can choose a fairly good amount of the background sky, and then what's left is the moon, and there's a couple of speckles here or there. Instead of showing the marching ants, we can also show overlay alpha. And so it shows here what's not selected. And if we invert that selection, we now have the moon selected. And a couple of speckles here or there, because it's a fairly grainy, noisy background. You know, it was low intensity. So you see some granularity, some graininess to that picture. And of course, we might want to first blank that out. So, for instance, one way to do that is to use the magic wand, like this one here, and give it a little bit of tolerance. Try about 20, 30, or 40, and that will give you a selection of that same color area. There's a couple of areas that are still blinking here with the marching ants. What you could do is you could iron those out. Right-click on the brush tool and look for Paint on Alpha, the hard or the soft. Let's do the hard brush and try with the left button. I think that will do it. Yep, that will erase the the selection. Actually, it will add to the selection. Right now, this is what's being selected, right? So that's one way to do it. We select the sky, and then once we are done, we invert the selection, and that will basically end up selecting the moon. That's not everything we need to select, though. There is something else. Yeah, I mean, we could just worry about only the moon that we have visible here, but there is also the invisible part of the moon, and there are some cases where you need that as well. In fact, you can see a tiny little hint of the moon right around here. So in some cases, you'll want to select that as well and keep it dark, but that's particularly important if you have some stars showing behind the moon that should be, in fact, occluded, should be hidden by the dark side of the moon. So what I suppose what we could do is, first of all, adjust the selection a little bit. Let's go to Selection, Adjust Alpha, and when you fiddle with those parameters, you can see is there any place that's still dark, is there a high contrast, maybe we'll trim it down even more, and then so at that point you could go and invert the alpha. Go to Invert Alpha in the selection menu, and you're kind of ready to go and pick it up, right? You could, first of all, maybe if this is a good stage you want to keep a snapshot of, go to Store Alpha. That's always a good idea every once in a while. You might also now clear the alpha mask. You might go and simply use right-click on that erase tool here and say clear selected to black. Oh, that's the inverted part. Let's go undo that and invert the selection back to that original selection. Now clear that to black. Okay, and now we can go and invert the selection again and invert alpha. There it is. So now we have a moon that we can select, and we can paint it. If the only thing we do is paint this against a sky that's relatively lit and has clouds, and you'll probably want that to be used in an additive mode, so that it just adds the bright part of the moon. The dark part is going to be ignored, so we don't actually have to use it if it is in additive mode. But there are some cases where the scene has a very thin, maybe you're doing an atmosphere, like a space scene from another moon, an imaginary planet, whatnot, but with a very thin atmosphere, and you still see a lot of the galaxy, a lot of the stars, and some of these stars have to disappear. Some of the galaxy, the Milky Way or whatever, has to disappear behind this dark part of the moon. So it is important that you have that covered too. So one thing I would do is perhaps use the circle tool to add to that selection, right? Ellipse to alpha. You can go here and now you have a new selection. Let's undo that. Control Z or U for undo, or use this green arrow to click back one. And what you'd like to do really is to have the selection kind of around here, big enough to contain everything here, and then still big enough also to have the entire part of the moon. Right, so now if you zoom in a little bit, you'll be able to control that better. Use the control key to shift the circle around. With the left mouse button, you can move it around if the control key is down. And if it doesn't have exactly the same shape as the moon, if it's a little bit oblong or oval, you can adjust that. You can paint to it too. You can go here, zoom in a lot, and then just like we did earlier with the brush tool, right click on the brush tool here and paint on alpha with the hard or maybe with the soft brush. So now here, if you try on the inner side, that's already selected. If you try on the outer, that's going to add to the selection. That's not what we want. So use the right button to remove the selection if you did remove too much, or use the left button to add to it. And that will allow you to gradually get this selection to come back. And you can also do combinations of selections. All right, I'll show you that in a second. But that's one way to kind of fix the selection so that we get back to exactly where the moon was. We take away if maybe there are some parts we didn't need. There you go. And so eventually you'll have a fairly decent selection for that moon. But let me show you another technique too. If I go back before that circle was added, where was it? One more there. So here's the circle, and that's only the circle. I'm going to store that selection. So we have a there, store alpha. We have one stored image of just the circle selection, and here is the one we had earlier that actually came from the image. We can in fact we can reload it here. If we say get image, it grabs the image from here and has it back in here. Now that's not a perfect one to use as a selection because it has some gray shades of different intensities. So if you think about it, if you replace this, it's not all fully selected, right? So you may want to adjust the contrast here to make it fully selected in the alpha channel, not just kind of various shades of gray selected. So adjust alpha allows you to make it brighter, and a fuller selection or contrast allows you to make sure it's all at very, all or nothing kind of on or off selections. Okay, and so the thing is that we want to get alpha, we want to store this, keep this alpha, we look at this one, these two need to be combined together, right? We have this one here and we have this one here, right? So how do we combine those? Well, what you can do is you can, for instance, start with this one, that's the big selection here, and then you can add this one that we stored, we can add that to it. Pay attention to what's happening here. Look at this one. Right now we are a little bit off here, but if we add this, now it has selected that part of the moon as well. The two were basically added together. This is basically a combination of two masks, adding the two masks together. And so now you can go and store that, and you now have, I would say, something that's a pretty perfect selection mask. Store alpha now has the moon and the invisible part of the dark side of the moon. The entire moon is basically there. And what you could do perhaps is tighten it a little bit if you feel it's actually going out too much into the dark side here. You could do things like select shrink alpha a little bit by just 1 pixel, see if that's enough. If it's not enough, go one more. Selection, shrink again. Another thing you could do is soften that selection a tiny little bit if you don't need it totally crisp and sharp on that drop off here. So you could do a little bit of box filter alpha or Gaussian blur alpha and just do a little bit. You'll see that turning of the color here because I have the alpha overlay enabled. So just give it a tiny little bit, or if you use the other technique, the other option for a box filter alpha, you can show the alpha as a grayscale, and so that's a good way to also see how much blurriness you give it. If you give it just 1 or 2, it's very little. Give it maybe 2 or 3, something like that. Especially if you have a high resolution image. If you're working with a small one, you only have a few pixels you can afford to bleed or to blend. After that, you might still want to shrink it a little bit more, and so now you have, I would say, a pretty good selection. Now it's time to pick that up as a custom brush. Right, so we have the dark side of the moon in the selection, and we have the bright part of the moon, the lit part, as well. And at that point, we want to pick that up as a custom brush. Use this tool here, the custom brush pickup tool. The thing is, I wouldn't just go with the selection altogether. I would give it a little bit of border around it. If you just use this one here, brush, use selected as brush, there are two potential problems. One is it's just going to have a big brush and only a small portion really represents the moon. And you might want to, on the other hand, it might also, I mean, that's what I just said. That's if there is actually a pixel or two selected on the edges still. It shouldn't, but it can, depending on how harsh you trimmed it on the adjusting for high contrast on the alpha. So it's better to actually really say what part you want to select, I think. And so what I'll do is I'll use this tool, custom brush selection tool, and I'll come close, but I'll give it a margin, a very sizable margin, right? And I'll give it hopefully about the same margin here, left and right. It doesn't have to be exactly centered. But something like this, now I can store this brush, store and manage a copy of this, and you can see it's transparent around it, it's opaque and dark on the dark side of the moon, and we have the light part. There are other things you could do with that, but certainly one thing I recommend is setting the mode. You will want to know if you set it to replace mode or additive mode. And here's the reason. If you have a scene in outer space now that you're going to use this moon with, right? So let me go and create a new image here, and I'll say something like this. And I create a scene that's relatively dark. Let's go erase it to black. And then add some stars to that, maybe with filter, animated, starry night, maybe even a little bit of an atmosphere, but lots of stars, star count high, and there. All right, so we have a starry sky, and I use this brush, I paint it, right? So now I may want to make it a little bit smaller, something like that. Right. So what's important when you see the stars, you do want the moon to cover that, right? When you click it here, you want the moon to cover that, right? That's okay if it's plain black, if the background of the sky is plain black. But here in this area, that's a different story, especially if you have a really bright atmosphere. Let's say you have filter, render, sky, something like this. You don't want the moon to appear like that, right? That's a replace mode, and what you want instead is an additive mode. Undo. Here you want the mode to go to additive, and it's only going to add it where the moon is actually there. Now that's a little bit too much, that's too harsh. So you could work with the opacity and reduce that a little bit, or in a significant amount. And then when you paint it, you see the moon just added, and it appears to be behind the sky. It really isn't, but it kind of gives that impression. It was added in, it was put there in an additive mode. Another mode that might work even better is a screen mode. Okay, so I would recommend using that as well and see if that works. In any of these cases, you'll see the moon where it's bright enough to be seen. You won't see any change in the color. It's not going to get darker, right? The atmosphere is bright enough that it's just going to add on top of the darkness of the moon. But that's the key thing to remember, is that the mode at which you apply that should not be default in a case like that. Right? You're not going to see the moon darken like that sky area. So that's why it's important, I think, when you are ready to store this image in your media browser, where you want to keep it handy. Let's say you have my shapes, my skies. I'm going to create a new folder here, my moons, right? My moons, okay? And planets. There you go. Who knows what else we'll do there. So, sky objects, right? My sky objects, perhaps. So here's the first one. Well, first of all, I want to make sure I reset it to 100% size, so we see it at its default. And by default, oh, and also full opacity. Where's my opacity here? We really want to see it the best possible it can be in this mode. And so that's what we store here. And we'll say Moon 01 default, or replace mode if you want to be explicit. There you go. And then there is another mode. We set the mode to screen, and we'll store that one and say that's Moon 01 screen, right? And then there could be perhaps additive. Maybe you like that mode as well. But still at full opacity, you can always reduce it, okay? And so what we'll do is we'll set the mode to additive, and we'll store that one as well. And that's also Moon 01 additive. Okay, so you now have 3 moons, same moon, but in different modes. And so we are able to quickly use them as needed, right? If we have this type of scene with bright skies, we're not going to use the default one because it's producing something like this. We're going to use the additive mode because it's producing something like that. Right? That's the additive mode. Or we're going to use the screen. I think the screen mode is actually the better one. So let's go and store this plain sky quickly. Store an image copy. And so here we go with the screen mode, and put it there. Right. And if you don't like how harsh this is, if it's too intense, let's remove the preview here of the brush. I'm done with where I want it. Now I can still go and undo with the interactive undo. I can say fade it a little bit, right? If I want to get only a hint of the moon in that place, right? But anyway, so that's that. How to work with some basic images that you want to start populating into your collections of your own personal collection of brushes. There's plenty included in Howler, but it's obviously just a starting point, and you'll always want to add quite a bunch more to that. Right, thanks for watching, and have fun waffling and howling.